Hello and welcome to this new series on misconceptions about consciousness. As usual, let me know if the audio and video are coming through okay, and we'll start with a brief meditation. Breathe easily and fully, filling up the lungs. We're taking a brief time out from the day to empty out for a few moments and consider new possibilities. All right, so welcome to this new series on misconceptions about consciousness, a three minds perspective. So we'll take a look at some of the common ideas about consciousness in our society, and we'll see that most of these common ideas are coming from the first mind perspective, right? The first mind, which is associated with localized identity, with usually a materialist framework, specifically a framework which assumes the primacy of matter. So Socorro says new possibilities, yes. All right. So first, let me just answer one question from last week. We just finished up a series on NDEs, on near death experience. And thank you for all your questions. I've communicated with many of you in the last week or so. And let's address one big thing that came up a lot, which is that all the talk about mystical type experiences and NDEs are confusing, right? There's so much talk about this kind of stuff. Everybody talks about it differently. Somebody's talking about a near death experience, another person's talking about a mystical experience, somebody's talking about psychosis, somebody's talking about enlightenment. So all this stuff can be confusing, right? So one way to see this is simply that what we're talking about is opening up a new range of experience or opening up a new range of the mind. It's a very simple way to say it. In fact, before I talked to the International Association for Near Death Studies, there's an organization. Before that, I had never really associated any of these experiences with what are called NDEs, near death experiences or near death like experiences. And even now, that wouldn't be my chosen terminology. I simply use that terminology because many people speak about it that way and it's popular, and so it's necessary to address this. So, a simple way of seeing it is simply sometimes the mind opens up and people experience new ranges of identity and new ranges of experience. It's a very simple way to see it. Now, is that what it's all about? Is that what life is about? Is that everything that we're talking about? No, not necessarily, because what we're talking about ultimately is not about having a particular kind of experience. Yes, the experiences that we have, it's nice to have a framework for them, or it's nice to know what they're suggesting and how they're influencing us, what they might mean. But that doesn't mean that the entire focus is on having such experiences. In fact, that can lead to difficulties, as we discussed before. So, putting all of that together just to say that the mind opens up new frames of experience. But ultimately, what we're talking about is settling in to our own deeper nature, very simply, right? Doesn't have to be mystical, doesn't have to be some kind of fancy experience. It's simply settling into our deeper nature. And ultimately, everything that anybody's talking about in terms of any kind of different kind of experience or dramatic experience is all an aspect of or an expression of this deeper potential that we are calling consciousness. All right. So just to clarify that, not to get, although we have to address it, and therefore because it's dramatic, it can be enthralling and a lot of questions can come up. But ultimately, it's not really about this or that experience. It's about simply settling into our own deeper identity. And the integration page, I put some other resources on there that it talks about some resources, some strategies that might help with this integration. Integration of what? Not just integration of a NDE or of a mystical type experience, but simply integration on the whole, right? Just dealing with the things that come up in life. And as we explore ourselves through meditation, the kinds of things that can come up, what are the helpful strategies? We talk about some of them here on this page. So with that, Beatrice says another perspective. Exactly. So with that, let's turn the page to the new topic, which is misconceptions about consciousness, a three minds perspective. If you'd like to learn more about the three minds, you can read about it here. And essentially what we're going to do is take a look at what this suggests about consciousness. So maybe we'll start with one or two of these. So the first misconception is that consciousness is different from the body and consciousness is different from matter. Right? So this is the first misconception about consciousness from a three minds perspective, right? Specifically from a second mind perspective. And it's important to see that because what we're doing is we're offering other explanations, we're offering other frameworks for understanding the very same experiences that have been talked about your whole life, whether it's mind or whether it's body or whether it's consciousness or whether it's world or identity. These are things that we're all familiar with through a particular lens, but can we see it in a new way? So from the second mind perspective specifically, it is a misconception that consciousness is different from the body. So how could this be? Well, we can see that when we talk about the body, obviously we know what the body is, right? The hands and the forearms, the musculature, the organs, the skeletal system. We know what the body is. Over here in the back, I have my Atlas of Human Anatomy. I'll put this down for a second. So this is the Atlas of Human Anatomy that I use in medical school, right? So the human body, it will show the human body in great detail, right? We know what this body is. And yet consciousness is so different. In fact, it's very hard to say what consciousness is, right? How do we define what consciousness is? We can say it's the potential to be aware, right? Is consciousness. But how can something that sounds so abstract, this potential to be aware, how could that be the same as the body, as we might be suggesting? If in fact, the idea that consciousness is different from the body is a misconception, how could they be the same? So to do that, we're speaking from a second mind perspective. What is that second mind perspective? It's that perspective where the identity is not localized as a physical thing and as a distinct structure. And that is quite abstract. It can be from the first mind perspective. So let's jump to looking at the body first, which is well known to us. If we look at the body, we can see that as we look more and more finely, as we look at a smaller and smaller level, as we dissect this body to finer and finer levels of granularity, we get, of course, smaller and smaller parts. So you'll go from the organism, the body as a whole, you'll go to the organ systems, and then we'll go to, let's say, the cardiovascular system or any other system. And then we'll go to the organ, such as the heart. We'll go down to the level of tissues and cells, and then macromolecules, molecules. We'll get to atomic particles, subatomic particles, and ultimately to elementary particles. And that's when we switch from particle physics to quantum physics. And at that point, what we call particles are actually vibrations or patterns in vast non-local fields, right? So ultimately, when we are talking about what the body is, right, we usually stop at the level of subatomic particles, at least in medical school. Of course, if you're studying physics or perhaps some other science, we may go beyond that level, but at least in medical school, and generally at the level of our society, the common knowledge is that the body is made up of small parts, such as ultimately elementary particles. In fact, if when you were in middle school or elementary school, you might remember playing with those molecular kits where you have the balls that represent atoms and you have the sticks that represent molecular bonds, and you connect one ball with the other with this stick, and that shows a molecule, right? Two atoms connected by a molecular bond. And that basically is the way we all learn to think of ourselves, to think of all matter. It's that these little distinct things, and you put a bunch of them together, and you have the human body, for example. But of course, we know that once we ask this question, what are these smallest particles made of? We know that they're actually not distinct things in and of themselves, even though that's how we learn about them and conceive of them, but they're actually vibrations or patterns in this vast non-local field. So at the most fundamental level that we know today, in terms of our societal knowledge, the human body is made from these multiple interfacing fields, even though that's not how we usually think about it. So, of course, you have to keep asking the question then, what are these fields made of? And right now, we don't know the answer to that. There's no final answer to that. But what I'm suggesting is that what we are referring to as the second mind and what has been talked about in traditions around the world as something akin to non local consciousness, that what we are interpreting mathematically as these non local fields, right? Remember, these are mathematical expressions. These mathematical expressions and representations of non locality are, in fact, partial, incomplete representations of a non local field of consciousness, right? So, one and the same second mind, as the first mind is trying to approach it, right? As this mind that is trained in particularity, that is trained in recognizing discreteness, as this mind is trying to approach what is called reality, right? What is trying to approach this non local field of consciousness, what it starts to discover naturally will be less and less local. And that is what is being represented through the findings in physics of mathematical expressions of non local fields. This is the interpretation of the three minds framework, right? So, in this case, now when we come back to our misconception, what was the misconception? From the second mind perspective, the idea that the body is fundamentally different than consciousness is a misconception. Now, does it mean that the body is the exact same and therefore we must never talk about the body as such, or that we cannot acknowledge the body to have a different qualitative nature and a quantitative nature in addition to or different from consciousness? No, of course it doesn't mean that. We understand the level of the first mind. We understand that society generally operates at the first mind level. And so we can speak the language, we can have the understanding, we can do the science, and we can also kind of see the bigger picture of where this might be going. All right. So the body then, when seen from a first mind perspective, up to the level of, let's say, small particles or particularity, at that level, the body is different from consciousness. That's the view. That's the first mind view. But when we inquire more deeply into the nature of the body and what the body is, and ultimately come to see that it is moving towards this non local nature, and if then, this is a big if, but if then, through our own introspective practice, we can recognize a second mind, right? This own nature, this own deeper nature, which is non local, then there can be a link that is drawn, a hypothetical link for each of us to investigate. This is not for anybody to believe. This is not for anybody to say this is absolutely true without doing their own investigation and reconciliation with science, with personal practice, with philosophy. All of this has to be done. But hypothetically, we can then draw that link that, yes, in fact, these non local fields, which ultimately represent the body, the original state of the body, we can say, that they are representations of this consciousness. And therefore, from the second mind perspective, the body is not fundamentally different from consciousness. All right. So let's see here. The body, it's physical, and consciousness is abstract. How to define the difference? Well, yes, exactly. This is the question. Even what does the word physical mean? Some people say physical means, by definition, that it's not mental, that it excludes consciousness. So we have to draw this line between the physical and mental to even define the physical, right? Does physical mean that it's solid or it's tangible? Does physical mean that it's intersubjective, meaning that many people recognize it? Does physical mean that it is not mental? Because if it means that it's not mental, then we're already acknowledging the existence of the mental in addition to the physical. And now we have to come up with a reason for creating something physical in addition to mentality, when in fact what we're experiencing subjectively is mentality to begin with. Right? So these are the confusions that come up when we start to define these terms. Let's see. All right. So why don't we start with this one? And if there are questions, you can send them on through, and we'll address some of the other questions next week as we continue this series on misconceptions about consciousness from the three minds perspective.